Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's getting better. Let's see if then by the end of the day you guys are more energized. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. We continue talking about the New Testament, and today we're going to have Marcos Diclei talk about, this month in fact is about all the letters from Paul, and he will talk about the Paul's letter to Titus. But before we start, as usually, I'm going to invite Mateus to do the initial reading and Maria Lucia to do the prayer. All right? Thank you.
So I'm going to be reading Happy Life, written by Divaldo Pereira Franco, but the spirit is Joana de Angelis. Exile evil from the provinces of your life. Replace the sick thought with a healthy one. Cut the pernicious net of unjustifiable suspicions with the scissors of belief in your neighbor. It is a torment to live armed against others, to see the negative side first, to detect imperfections. There is nobody on earth with a defect, just as there is not a single person who does not also possess virtue, bad as that person may be. Look for everyone's good side, and you will find that you are a renewed and a fable.
Good morning. Let's close our eyes and take a deep breath so we can connect our minds and hearts to the good spirits who are here this morning, so they can inspire us during Jesus' teachings that will be presented by Marcos. Let's thank God for this blessing opportunity, and we ask again to all of them to inspire us and Marcos, so we can learn from this lesson and then take those teachings into our daily life. We thank God and Jesus, and so be it.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to those also watching us through the internet, and even those we came to learn that may listen to the TSS lectures in the Spiritist radio. So maybe you're driving or on Facebook. May God bless our day, your day, and may we all learn a little bit together. This weekend is certainly a special weekend for many, as we remember the sacrifice and the fight that so many who even have given their lives to support the freedom that we enjoy today. Some of us who dig a little bit in history or watch TV in the present days or just walk on the street, we hear a lot about Remembrance Day. And even if we are immigrants to this country, maybe even if we haven't had a direct participation in such events like World War II or family members who participated, we take a lot for granted the freedom that we have. And a lot of our brothers and sisters and participated on that, right? So we owe our gratitude to many of them who may be here among us incarnated, or who may be in the spiritual realm. And at the same time, this reminds us of the reflection of Paul, who also gave his life and fought, as some of us may know the way he called it, the inner battle. And we saw last week the discussion between Saul of Tarsus and Paul of Tarsus, his own transformation. That's a big, big battle that is very relevant to us. Because in one way or the other, sooner or later, every single one of us will face that very same battle. Or the good battle, as John says in his gospel. I fought the good battle, and Paul says that as well. So that's why we are going to continue this month studying a little bit about Paul and his story of transformation, which is our story of transformation. We have a lot to learn from him. We also remind ourselves of the importance of staying true to the message of Jesus, to the example of Jesus, independent of religion. His message is one single message of love. And the golden rule. Does anyone remember the golden rule? What's the golden rule? Very good. We have a very smart crowd here today, so we are on pressure. So the golden rule is do unto others what would like others to do unto us, right? We can come here and say all the beautiful words, but if we don't do that, we are just fooling ourselves. That's the reality, and Paul's history reminds us of that. And the core of the message is a letter from Paul to Titus. And I am particularly a very curious person. Sometimes I look at those things, who was Titus? Why would Paul write to him? Right? And I've done that as well with Timothy in the past. Who is that man? Right? So we are going to see through a little bit of the bites of the history of Titus that when we are open to serve God without any personal agenda to show off how good we are, that we are better than others because we are Spiritists or Catholics, bless you, or any other kind of religion. If we don't have any other agenda but sincerely wants to serve, God really does marvelous things through us. And that's really the expectations for us on this life. And we'll see a little bit of that with the story of Titus. Now, who was Titus? Who here ever heard about Titus before or know anything about him? Not even the smart people raised their hands. For those who cannot see the audience, the smart people here are the youth, the teens who are watching the lecture, and I asked them to give me feedback at the end to see how boring that was. So, Titus was a loyal collaborator of Paul. And to the point that Paul starts his letter saying, "To my true son in common faith." So he called him son. He really loved Titus, and Titus also loved him. Right? The same affection, I want to say the same, but a similar affection that we saw when we studied together here, his letter to Timothy. Right? Titus, for more than we haven't heard of him, he has been referenced 13 times across the New Testament in different places. Interesting enough, we don't remember very much of him, right? And here's the interesting part. We always think about the people of the gospel like old men, like me, white hair, right? Having a hard time to walk, that kind of stuff, right? But Titus, look at how Emmanuel described Titus in the book Paul with Stephen. We just spoke about the book last week. He says, when Paul met Titus, he had barely emerged from childhood. He barely left childhood behind. Which means he left childhood a couple years ago. But he's not even an adult yet. So what does that mean? He was like one of you. He was in his teens. At this point here, was really early teens, maybe 14, 13. So he was a very young man. Right? And then that's something that often surprises us, and that's what we discussed before, because we have that perception of religion being something from people who have aged a bit, like us. But no, throughout the history we see a lot of young people. Last week we discussed about a young man. Who remembers the young man we discussed last week? I think Erica, Michelle, and both Rafael spoke about him. Stephen, exactly. He was the first martyr of Christianity, right? He was murdered. He was stoned. He was also a young man. And I've seen so many young people throughout history. We discussed about one name here, Timothy. A couple weeks back, we spoke about John, who was a young man as well himself when Jesus called him, right, to follow, and many others. How about Spiritism? Any references of any young people in Spiritism at the very beginning? Because we remember about Allan Kardec, who was a professor on his 50s. Any young people? Crossing the border here, where this spiritual phenomena started with the Fox sisters. They were also in their teens, right, here in the US. And then when the phenomena started with Allan Kardec, the main mediums who were working with Allan Kardec was also teens, right? Hermance Dufault and a few others. I didn't put the name, but there's reference of other young people practicing mediumship, right? So what happened today, right? Why we don't see that very much? And it reminds us of Dr. Rossandro Kingsley, which is a psychologist from Brazil, and Rossandro really says about it that we often talk about the young people as they are our future. Oh, they are the future of this or that, the country, or future of Spiritism, and we keep them way there in the future, and we don't give them the opportunities, and we forgot that they are our future today. Therefore, we need to engage them on godly things and in valuable things today, because they may be young in their bodies, but they are immortal souls. They may be older than me. Caught you now. They may be older than us, right? So why don't we give them the opportunity today? And that's what we have been trying to do today, right? Presently, to involve them. They want to contribute. They have their own calling. They have their own desires and aspirations and dreams. And we have to support them. They want to be respected. They wanted to be heard. And that was the same with Titus. No different, right? But Titus, once he saw the opportunity, we'll see it, he embraced it. He didn't waste time. So Paul gave him the opportunities. So we encourage the young people here and those who are younger for a longer time, like us, to embrace the opportunities. Let's not waste time. And as it's not different from the reality of Christians, it was different from the reality of Jesus. As soon as Titus started his journey to contribute, to help, right, to be with those who follow Jesus, he found himself in a very, very hot seat, in a very heated dilemma and discussion. It was a very tough spot for him to start. So much so that the early Christians not only wanted his help, but they wanted also a piece of him. Literally, they wanted a piece of his body. And we'll see about it. And it starts with... the story begins with Paul. We remember the story from last week from Paul. If you don't remember, watch the lecture, the TSS talks from last week. After Paul became a Christian and started to follow the Jesus principles, he became a very humble man. He became a simple worker, building a craftsman, doing carpets and tents and sandals to sell, right? Because he didn't want to be a burden for anyone. So he basically worked to pay for his food or whatever he lived. And he was in his hometown, Tarsus. And then a very relevant man at that time from another location, Antioch, which was a Christian community, came to Tarsus after Paul, because it was time for Paul to start helping the community and working. So Barnabas went there and said, Paul, we need someone like you in Antioch. And Paul went to Antioch to help. He needed workers. And when we talk about churches, we don't talk about cathedrals and things like that. The churches of that time were just a group of people like us who probably rented a place, right? Or by charity used the place that belonged to someone. And they not only discussed and studied the gospel, but they also help a lot of people. They help the sick people, right, who couldn't go to a doctor. They gave food to those who didn't have anything to eat. That was the work of those churches. And if you see the definition of the word churches, it's just a group of people gathering together for a common purpose, right? So in the city of Antioch, there was that church. It was a main church, actually. Antioch, it's in the region of Turkey. In Antioch, we can do an analogy with Toronto. It was the commercial center of Turkey. It's a very relevant city. It was the largest city. In the church of Antioch, it is really hard to describe in the words that Emmanuel uses in the book Paul Stephen. But there's no perfect group, obviously, other than the group where Jesus belonged to. But it was the ideal place. It was a very harmonious place where everyone sincerely loved each other. Everyone sincerely helped each other at all times. There were no gossips and indifference, right? They all served for the sake of serving and helping and loving. There, the principles that Jesus brought to us were really shining in its purest form. Right? The exemplary service to the community, to the poor, to the sick was evident, and they worked tirelessly, all of them. And because it was a commercial center, everyone had the resource that they needed, because everyone had a job. They all worked hard during the day, and after the work, they were there serving the community. Right? Similar to many, but I think we can compare the scale of what they did with what we're trying to do, obviously, right? But it's a similar routine, working really hard to have the resources they need to help the others. They were an example of doctrinary soundness because they really follow what Jesus taught us. They didn't change and deterped and accommodated things. And this environment actually was such an elevated vibration, such an elevated spiritual environment that enabled high spirits or superior spirits to present themselves through very rare mediumistic form. There's a type of mediumship called direct voice or pneumatophony, where the mediums hear directly the voice of the spirits. It can be in their own minds and spirits. It's an inner reception, you can call it. Or even the spirits can use the material matter that is around us and have that voice coming from an external source. But it's a very rare phenomenon. And in the Bible we see that the Holy Ghost spoke with them. And Emmanuel clarifies that the Holy Ghost is no more than the superior spirits who are there assisting Jesus in his work. And it's so confusing for us sometimes, right? What is that Holy Ghost? So that's it. So that's the kind of church. And that is where Paul met Titus for the first time. Titus was part of that group. He was actually a pagan, a Greek, so he wasn't Christian before. But he became a Christian as a very young man. So Paul, they both felt a bond, right? Because of the common love for the thoughts of Christ and the service that they had. So they really bond together to the point that they would see each other as brothers, and Paul would call him as even a son. So Paul not only helped him to learn more about Christianity, about Jesus, about the gospel, but he also taught him his trade. So he taught him how to produce the carpets and the tents and the sandals. So he basically gave him a job, a profession. He taught him everything. After some time, I don't know if it's probably a couple years, and this is a very long story that I'm going to cut short. So hint to read the book, Paul and Stephen, we have here in the library. Paul was really concerned because most of the Christian churches or regroupments or groups were working to spread the gospel among the Jewish people. And Paul is very known by his desire to spread the gospel to the non-Jewish tradition. And once he was talking to Barnabas, he said, I'm really worried that in 50 years from now, people will remember Jesus as a criminal who was crucified among the robbers. People won't remember him if we keep him under the limited circle of Judaism. So he said, you know what? I'm going to travel. I'm going to travel spreading the message. But I don't want to be a burden to the places that I'm going. So I'll go. And he came up with a mobile workshop to bring with him. Whenever he stopped, he would work. And then he called the young Titus and said, Titus, I have a mission for you. The group in Antioch needs the support from our work. So I need you to take care of my shop. He had a tent somewhere, right? But let's think about, he had a store, a shop somewhere. I'm going to travel for a while, maybe months, maybe over a year. I need you to stay and take care of the work. And that was one of the first tasks that he gave to Titus. So Titus kind of enabled him to start his travel. So he went with Barnabas, the two of them. So after a few years, and a lot of the churches that were created in different places were created by Paul and Barnabas and the people who they met and formed to take care of the churches. Paul returned to Antioch after maybe a couple of years. But that harmonious place had changed quite a bit when he came back. Both Paul and Barnabas, they were really surprised by, vibe? By that sadness vibe, that sad sentiment among the people. Bless you. There was a lost sense of unity. He would see a little group of people here, a little group of people there, trying to do things their own way. They were now received with the warm fraternity that they felt before. And those meetings and the mediumistic phenomena that they had before from the superior spirits had stopped. So the church or the group had changed quite a bit after they left. And he even saw influence of Judaism in the group. They started to introduce some of the ceremonies and costumes from the Pharisees among that group, who really was an example of simplicity, the same simplicity that Jesus taught us. So they were really concerned. And the chapter here in the book, Paul and Stephen, is called Battles Over the Gospel. Because we can see that in early stages of the history, things started to shift already. We started to take a little detour from the core message of Jesus. And that was what Paul was worried about. So again, a group of messengers came from Jerusalem, where the apostles who were left, John and James and Peter, were there. They lived with Jesus, right? So they were very well respected because of that. They were the ones who lived with Jesus. Everyone else had died already. So they sent two messengers to the church of Antioch. And because of Paul wasn't very, didn't have a lot of affinity with the Jewish customs, right? He wanted the simplicity of Jesus. Those messengers gave them a hard message, saying, you guys have no authority over the gospel of Jesus. The authority lies with those who lived with Jesus. Talking about the Galilean apostles, Paul and James. And then he said, you have also no authority to go and spread the gospel around to the Gentiles. So I suggest you to lower your expectations. And you guys need to follow their recommendations. So he was really surprised. As if someone comes here to the TSS and say, listen, there's now a new authority on the Spiritism, and you know your meetings here, you got to stop saying this and that because you have no authority anymore. So they started to regulate, to take out the freedom, right? They said the gospel is under the law of Judaism. Therefore, you have to obey the customs of Judaism. Can you believe that? That's very impressive, right? No wonder we still see nowadays people still changing things, and giving false guidance. We have to be very vigilant. And as Allan Kardec taught us, use rational faith. Does this really make sense? We have to think and not have blind faith, right? Because blind faith can be a disaster. And if we look at the history, we will see how many disasters and atrocities we had because of that. So, long story short, Paul asked Peter directly for a meeting in Jerusalem. And they even called it a Council of Jerusalem. So he wanted to be there, to go there and clarify this message of having no authority over the gospel, and the gospel being spread only among the Jewish, and even have to obey the ceremonies of Judaism. And one of them is circumcision. So they wanted everyone, do you want to follow the gospel of Jesus? You have to be circumcised. So for Paul, that was an absurd. As a former Pharisee who made that transformation and understood what were things of the world that are not that relevant from the core that Jesus taught us, for him, that was an absurd. So he went to Jerusalem. But before he left, decided to go to Jerusalem. But before he left, he taught something. Titus, I have a mission for you. Here comes Titus again. You come on the trip with me. Because if they are not allowing the pagans or Gentiles to speak about the gospel because they consider the Gentiles as second-class people, I want you to open your mouth and awe them. I want you to talk about the gospel of Jesus. Because he was he was one of the brightest minds and hearts of the church in Antioch. He brought to him, hoping that Titus would speak to the council and make them change their mind about the Gentile people. Remember, Gentile is a term to reference people who are non-Jewish. So we are Gentiles, right? So he brought Titus with him, the young Titus, right? Like one of you. And when he arrived in Jerusalem, Simon Peter, received them, right, Barnabas, Paul, and Titus, and a few others, with great fraternity. They were happy to see each other. But then, when Paul and everybody looked around, Paul was a former Pharisee. When he entered into the church in Jerusalem, the group in Jerusalem, like the TSS from Jerusalem, I'm being very careful to you not imagine those fancy churches, right? But simple places of service. When he entered, he felt he was going into a synagogue. He felt that feeling in the air that was very familiar with him as a former doctor of the law. Paul was the authority of the Jewish not very long ago. So he felt like he was going into those Pharisee temples. he saw James, who was one of the disciples of Jesus, right? One of the 12, dressed almost like a Pharisee. And he had calculated gestures, and he spoke with, very precise words, very concerned with exterior appearances. And that for them was shocking. They would never expect that in the church of Jerusalem, right? And James looked at Titus head to foot, and with the air of superiority, right? And the first thing he said, who is this man? Is he part of the elected people? You see the presumption of him, right? That's what they see. The Jewish are here, everybody else was over there. Is he part of the elected people? So yeah, he's part of a group over there. He's one of the brightest followers of Jesus, and he preaches and do this and that and that and that. Is he circumcised? And Paul was fuming at that point, right? Circumcised? What are you talking about? No, he is not. He said, well, I then recommend him to stay on the front at the reception. He cannot join your meeting. And there was so much discussions of it that I won't get into because of the time. But the heat was on. Then the group was divided. There was a group, let's say on the left, who were in favor of James, who were the familiar with the Judaism, with the Jewish people. And for them, they have to follow the Jewish principles. There was a group on the right with Paul that they said, we are followers of Jesus and his gospel, right? His message. We are not Pharisees. Therefore, we are not adopting the customs of the Jewish people. It was like divided. Think about a group of people arguing who is the best here, the Toronto Maple Leafs or the team over there in Montreal, or the Blue Jays playing with the New York Yankees. Or another analogy, fans of Brazilian soccer and the people from Argentina talking about their soccer. It was a heated discussion. Obviously, I'm bringing to frivolous things, but their discussion was at the more relevant things, obviously. But the heat was on. And Simon Peter, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem, was quiet in the middle. And Paul looking at him, you're not going to say anything? And Paul finally said, I appeal to Simon Peter. What do you have to say, Peter? And Peter was, what do I say now? And then to Paul's surprise, he said, well, let's let the young Titus be circumcised tomorrow morning. Oh my goodness, Paul was just furious, right? How could you do that? And the discussion was so heated. But that's what the meeting ended. If you want to be part of the discussion, you have to be circumcised. So they adjourned the meeting. And then after, in an offline conversation, Peter was talking to Paul. And Paul expressed all his disappointment and frustration and everything. And he wanted to go home. He wanted to leave. Say, you know what? I don't want this meeting anymore. You guys are completely off track. But then he thought about all the Gentile people who were expecting him to step up and free them from the conventionalism of Judaism and stop this story of having the gospel under the control of the Jewish law, stop the obligation of early Christians to be circumcised, and etc., etc. Or Paul would go home for the sake of his peace of mind because he couldn't bear that discussion anymore, or he would pick up the fight. He decided to stay for the sake of his people because he made a commitment. And then Peter told him, Paul, calm down. This is a small concession that we need to make to be able to have our win tomorrow. Now look at the term, small concession. Tell that to Titus, right? We had to be circumcised. But anyway, that's a sacrifice. So Titus started making a sacrifice because there was a bigger problem in discussion than his own well-being with the circumcision. And here's what Peter revealed to Paul. Here's the core of the problem. He told Paul that the church of Jerusalem had more than 100 people coming every day to be treated, that depended on medicines, that depended on food. And if they didn't have the money, which was provided by the Jewish community, they wouldn't be able to help so many people in need. So Peter he has in his mind, or I let the Jewish people do what they are doing and help the people, or for the sake of being a purist, I stop helping everybody else and we just talk about the gospel and we don't help anyone. So he felt compelled and accepted the influence of Judaism in the church for the sake of helping people. It's a very tough situation to be, right? And then Paul was a strategist. And if you read this book, you are going to see every problem they presented to him, he comes up with a strategy. And everybody said, wow, why didn't I think of that? It's a brilliant solution. He said, oh, that's your problem. Fear not. I'm going to take Barnabas and a few others, and we are going to travel to all the churches that we went through, and we are going to establish a regular collection to gather money and bring it to Jerusalem, so you guys can finally become independent of these obligations with the Jewish people. Isn't that a brilliant strategy? But he would have to sacrifice himself to do that. And Peter was really rejoiced with that. But he didn't reveal that, obviously, to anyone. But that was the core of the problem. And that's why in Spiritism and many other religions, we are very careful with our dependence on other organizations, in political organizations. Because sooner than later, they may come and say, I'm helping you, now you do this, or you have to do this way. That's why we rely on sincere volunteers who do not have any other agenda than learning and helping each other. This is a very important lesson, man. Very important. Very important at that time, and is still very important today. So the next day, they resumed the council. Probably Titus was very sore on that meeting, but they started, and things were not different. The group on the left, the group on the right, and discussions for hours and hours and hours, and then Peter finally stepped up and said, that's enough. And he brought, very inspired, he brought the message of Jesus to everyone, saying, this is not what Jesus asked us to do. He asked us to take the gospel to everyone, not only to the Jewish people, but to anyone. If we can help a pagan or a non-believer to become a Christian, right, to become a son of God, that's what we want to do. So there was a long and inspired discourse, and he finally breaks most people on their hard-headed assumptions, leaving only James and a few others. James was pretty much alone, standing until the end. But he had no choice. He was pretty much alone. So he said, fine, we will separate things. But to some extent, there are three things that we need to keep. Right? He said we need to forsake idolatry. Any Christians, any followers will have to forsake idolatry, right? Which is worship statues and things like that, or other gods. We talked about 10 Commandments in our video last night, or a couple of days. Avoid sexual immorality, right? They need to be respectful people. And last, abstain from eating meat of strangled animals. And then Paul looked at Peter, said, that's a good deal, right? Because immorality and idolatry, we don't like them at all. We don't want that to happen. And as for food, as long as people don't abuse and exaggerate, we are good with that. So problem solved. They finally resolved it. And out of the council, everyone got a letter. Every single participant had a letter of the church of Jerusalem saying, you can preach the gospel to the Gentiles, establish those churches without the need to follow those rules and etc. So they got their freedom, right? And it's very likely that we know so much about Christianity today thanks to those people, thanks to people like Titus, Paul and others. So Paul, obviously after that, started his travels for the collection. That's why we discussed here before so many trips that he had. And we still had a problem where many of the churches were really following some of the Judaism principles, going astray from the core of Jesus' messages, right? The adopted ceremonies. So it started a period of healing, or as we discussed a couple of days ago as well, back to basics. We have to go back to the basics, to the golden rule, right? We don't need to be circumcised to be considered sons of God. And circumcision for them was like baptism, right? Someone told me once, well, if your daughter is not baptized, she's not a daughter of God. So really, right? So we respect others' opinions, but they also need to respect ours. That's exactly what Paul did. Any lessons to us here? What do you guys think of this story? And you may be thinking, why does it have to do with the letter of Paul to Titus? Because I think we need to understand a bit of the context. So we understand that this young man started his service making a lot of sacrifices himself. And we can understand the sacrifice that the early Christians did. And they are not different of the sacrifices that we may need to do. Or there's a better word instead of sacrifice, the choices that we need to do. Because in many situations we are asked to accept the conventionalism of the world in detriment of what we believe as immortal spirits. And it's a personal choice that we need to make. So Paul was traveling, and as part of his travels, he took the young Titus with him. So Titus, it's another mission for you. I want you to go to an island in Greece called Crete. And it's an island where we are having lots of problems. People are following the conventionalism of Judaism. They are forgetting about the gospel. They are involved with immorality and excesses of food, alcohol. Right? They are missing the point. And I want you to go and help us to establish churches in every single city of that island. So he left Titus over there, on that church, on that island actually, right? There were some groups that were doing things completely different than where they should do. And then he decides to write to Titus. Oh, I skipped the picture of the consul, right? So probably a bunch of people in such a tight place. Imagine a heat discussion over there where you don't have much space to take a break from each other. It was a heated discussion, but with a positive outcome at the end. But then he decided to write to Titus, which is the point we want to highlight here. And he starts by explaining to Titus why he left him in Crete, right, in the island of Crete. And he gave him a few clarifications, basically 3 main points on this letter. So he asked him to visit all cities in that island, and in every single city to find people who were an example of integrity and honor and trust, and that are sincere in serving God, and appoint them to be the heads of those groups, those churches. So in order to have people respecting them, the churches, he asked him to appoint elders. What is an elder? Someone like me? No. Someone mature, yes. Someone old enough that they are respected. Because in the old ancient communities, we used to respect the old people. Right? People who were younger for a longer time, we usually respect and listen to them. So he was the question. Now, imagine Paul asking a teenager, and in the book he said he was not even 20 years old when he had this mission, a teenager going to a foreign island to appoint elders and establish the churches. And he would handpick those elders with that culture at that time. How does that mission sound for you? It's pretty tough, right? We will say, can't do it. Titus gladly said, we'll do it. We'll make it happen. So he had to hire, to recruit and train those elders, because many of them didn't know about the gospel of Jesus. So he had to find the right people and then teach them. That's what he says. Teach sound doctrine. Sometimes it's easy, isn't that a truth? When we try to learn something, knowing how to do it in an incorrect way, isn't it harder for us to learn? Because we have to unlearn what we know to learn the right thing. It's very different than we don't know something and we learn it from the scratch. We have no vices, no habits, right? It's like learning English. We learn that broken English, and then to adjust, I think, is way harder than if we learn from the scratch, we learn it right in the first time, right? So it was the same way. He would find people who were really pagans. He had no knowledge and understanding of God and Jesus at all. That was probably easier than picking the people with their roots in the Jewish beliefs that needs to be adjusted. But he faced all that. So that was the first. How would he do that with the elders? As he would have to respect the elders. Usually the elders would appoint him for something. So Paul recommends him exemplary conduct. And this is very applicable for us today, right? It's very valuable for us today. Conduct. If you get a new job, we were talking about this today, it doesn't matter your beautiful resume on the wall. It's really what you do, how you behave, how you act, your integrity. It's easy for us to come here for a lecture, but what do we do after we go home? That's integrity. So that's what Paul says. Make sure no one has anything to say about us. Interesting that he says that about us, not about you. Because Titus was there representing Jesus. Do you get that? So make sure no one has anything to say about us. It's like someone coming to a Spiritist center for a lecture. We don't talk about what we believe. We don't talk about what we think, because we don't know much, we don't think much, but we talk about what the Spiritism teaches us about certain topics. We talk about what Jesus taught us about certain topics. Because it's us, it's the movement, it's the Spiritist movement, it's the Christian movement, which is bigger than anyone else. So he recommends Titus, be an example of conduct. So that when people look at you and say, who are you to tell us those things? They will understand exactly why you have the authority to tell us those things. Even if you go to Allan Kardec in the Medium's book, he said the best defense against spirits who wants to cause us trouble or lie, right, or be connected with inferior spirits is the conduct, the moral conduct of the medium, because we won't connect with inferior spirits if we had a more elevated conduct. Just a message to him. And then the third point and the last one before we wrap up, avoid pointless arguments. Whoever, raise your hands here, whoever using your social media found people talking about certain things about Spiritism, certain things about Jesus, certain things about God, that you said, come on, it can't be true, and you engaged on some conversations and that battle just got heated, and after a while it's just a waste of time. Have you ever experienced that? Raise your hands. Yeah, I've done that so many at the very beginning. It's like people from other religions talking nonsense about Spiritism. They say, I can let that go. I have to defend it, right? And hours, and it's just a waste of time. Because it's their belief against your belief, And if someone is not sincere about learning, it's just a waste of time. It's like one of your friends starting an engagement with you, talk about God. Does God exist? Does not God not exist? For more that you explain, they would not accept. That's a sign that it's a waste of time. If they are sincere to understand, it's a different story. We should explain. But most of the cases, it's a waste of time. So Paul told him, don't waste your time with pointless arguments. Right? You have the authority. Use your example. Use the scriptures. But don't waste your time with those kind of discussions. And he didn't give Titus a lot of details, as in many of his letters, recommendations of how to do things, because he trusted Titus. He trusted Titus very much. And the letter is a very short letter, actually. And just to end, this is one of the passages over there he wrote to Titus. He actually reminds us of certain teachings from André Luiz that we had here, right? About what we believe. And he was talking about he called them those of the circumcision. He was talking about those Jewish sympathizants, right, who were in the churches. To the pure all things are pure, but to the corrupt and unbelieving nothing is pure. It's in what we see, is what we believe. So people who were not sincere to serve and help, they would appoint defects and errors in every single thing. They even would say, you cannot eat this, you cannot eat that, you cannot eat without washing your hands. A lot of superficial things, right? But the essence, they were missing the point, because their hearts were not pure in intention to help. This is just one little extract. But friends, this is the summary of the story for us, that Paul is really that example of service and inner battle that we all, if we haven't reached that point in our lives yet, sooner or later we will. Sooner or later we will. This story also reminds of the importance of to stay true to the Christian principles, to the Spiritist principles. And always ask. When in doubt, always ask. Let's not assume. Let's not believe in things with blind faith. It's a very dangerous place to go. If God gave us intelligence, it's for us to use it, right? And finally, the story of Titus is a beautiful example for us of the potential of our younger generation for today. We can engage them today. We can trust them today. We have a lot to learn from them. And for you all younger than us, it's an opportunity for you to embrace those opportunities. Live on earth as we all live. Yes, we can have fun and enjoy life, but we should think about the purpose of life. Why are we here? Right? And you will reach the conclusion that we are here to learn and to serve and to love, and we can do so much together. And God bless us all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marcos. We do have a few minutes for questions or any comments. Anyone from the internet have any comments? Go ahead, Marco.
So it's just a little comment, I guess, not more of a question, but just that what's interesting in the prior story, I think Titus is a good example, as you said, but like everyone that Paul touched, right? Because every single person that interacted with Paul went through a transformation, including the healthy way.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, that step in the book that he described really well, where they had this discussions about what is it that we're doing here.
Yeah.
It's part of a broader transformation. It's not individual.
Yeah.
But it's a transformation of thought, right? And that's how I like to see it. And that's so important for all of us here, because we always think about post-transformation as something mystical and phenomenal. But in the end, the real transformation occurs when he touches every single person, even the ones by the letters, right? but not only the ones he connected to, but I don't know how many letters he wrote and how many miles he ended up walking, but I think it's a huge message for all of us, because even in Spiritism, in other religions, anywhere we go, there's always this currents, tendencies, adaptations. We absorb things, we change it. We think that we're changing in a positive way sometimes, but we always have to go through that transformation of thought.
Yeah.
And go back to the bottom, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Right? And I think you put it so well. It's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
Do you want to summarize it for the people in
Yeah,
here?
what Marco was saying is that the story that we just went through, right, just a tiny piece of the story, very summarized, is beyond Paul's inner transformation, beyond our inner transformation individually, which is an inner victory, I would say, for a public transformation, for a transformation of a group of people, for a transformation of a community, right? And how important it is for us to be alert and reflect on the influx of ideas and knowledge that we see around, because we must protect. I think even Emmanuel says that, or André Luiz, right? If you get the light, you have to protect the light. If you have the light, you have to protect the light, right? In short.
Any other questions or comments? No? Alright. Thanks so much,
brother.
man. Alright, so I want to thank you for those watching us through the internet. We're going to get prepared for the passes here, so we're going to disconnect. So hope to see you guys again on our studies on Wednesdays or here on Sundays. Thank you, everyone.